We've just got some breaking news in from Buckingham Palace, folks. So this statement has just come in from Buckingham Palace, and I'll read it for you. It goes on to say, His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and...
4 minutes ago, a private message reached King Charles and transformed an already fragile royal dispute into a deeply personal confrontation. Meghan had not simply requested permission to return to royal life. She had presented herself under a title connected to Princess Diana, a title the palace had deliberately prohibited from being used by anyone else. Charles read the wording twice, placed the message on the table, and demanded to know who had allowed it to reach the palace. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles felt the anger rise before anyone dared to speak. Meghan had spent years outside the working monarchy, yet every suggestion of a return unsettled the royal family. A working royal is a family member who performs duties on behalf of the crown, and she was now asking to step back toward that world on terms that reopened old wounds. The king looked again at the phrase near the top of the request, Diana's royal successor. That ceremonial description had been privately forbidden because it suggested that one woman could inherit Diana's public identity, emotional place, and influence. To him, the wording did not merely challenge palace protocol. It turned a dead woman's memory into pressure during a negotiation over status, access, protection, and power. Meghan's proposal went beyond a symbolic gesture. She wanted entry to Windsor, a place used for royal residence, ceremony, and family business. She also asked for a public appearance beside family members, restored security arrangements, and recognition as the natural continuation of Diana's humanitarian mission. Each demand carried risk, but together they formed something more dangerous, a route back into royal life built around the one name the monarchy could never treat casually. Charles stood beside the long table and read the page in silence. He removed his glasses, placed them beside the message, and fixed his attention on the waiting aide. "That title will not enter this family," he said. His voice was quiet. The decision was absolute. The monarch ordered palace officials to trace every hand that had touched the request. He wanted to know whether Harry had approved the language, whether Meghan had acted alone, and whether someone inside the royal household, the staff and offices supporting the sovereign, had encouraged her. The possibility of internal help changed the mood at once. Before any response could be drafted, William received the exact wording. He read the forbidden title, closed the file, and asked to speak to his father immediately. Charles had rejected the words as a monarch, but William was about to confront them as Diana's son. Behind the forbidden title were 3 people carrying 3 very different versions of the same history. Charles remembered a marriage that had ended in pain and public judgment. William guarded the memory of a mother whose name had followed him through every stage of his life. Meghan saw Diana as a symbol of independence, rejection, and survival. When those interpretations collided, the argument was no longer about a return to royal duties. It was about ownership of memory. Charles felt the past pressing against the authority he now carried. His relationship with Diana remained one of the most painful chapters in the monarchy's modern history, because every mention of her reopened questions about love, betrayal, responsibility, and regret. The monarchy was not merely a family. It was the institution led by the sovereign and supported by working relatives. Meghan's use of the forbidden title therefore threatened both the king's private emotions and the public order he was expected to protect. Meghan understood the comparison differently. She believed that she and Diana had both entered royal life with hope, only to face isolation, hostile headlines, and pressure from traditions that allowed little room for personal freedom. To her, the title was not theft, it was recognition. Yet Charles heard something colder inside those words. He heard an attempt to turn suffering into authority, and memory into a bargaining tool. William received the wording while preparing for a scheduled meeting. He reached the phrase, "Diana's royal successor," and his expression changed at once. The prince dismissed the waiting aide, closed the folder, and remained alone for several minutes. For him, this was not about palace rules. It was an intrusion into his mother's identity. He believed her legacy belonged neither to Meghan nor to the institution, and he would not allow anyone to use it as a path back to royal power. Harry stood in the most dangerous position of all. He understood why his wife compared herself to Diana, because he had watched Meghan struggle under the same kind of public pressure that once surrounded his mother. But he also knew how deeply William reacted whenever her name became part of a campaign. The younger brother feared that defending his wife could now be seen as betraying the woman both sons had spent their lives protecting. Camilla watched Charles grow more defensive and quietly warned him against acting too quickly. The Queen Consort told the king during a private conversation that a harsh rejection could transform Meghan's forbidden title into a symbol of resistance. He listened, but his anger did not fade. William was already preparing his own response, and Meghan had no idea that both men were moving toward the same boundary. The forbidden words had not appeared without warning. They had been born during an earlier palace confrontation, where one sentence changed everything and turned private resentment into a royal crisis. The title that enraged Charles had first been spoken months earlier, far from cameras and public ceremonies. It happened during a private planning meeting for a Diana Memorial initiative at Kensington Palace. Meghan had expected her proposal to be welcomed as an act of reconciliation. Instead, she was told that she would never be permitted to represent Diana's legacy in an official royal capacity. The refusal was calm, brief, and devastating, and it became the trigger for everything that followed. Meghan entered the discussion convinced that her idea would be difficult to reject. A memorial initiative was a limited royal program created to support causes linked to a deceased family member, and this one focused on homelessness, mental health, and vulnerable children. She believed those causes matched the humanitarian work she and Harry had already pursued. To her, participation was not a demand for power. It was a chance to return through service. William understood the proposal very differently. He knew Diana's name could draw attention, donations, and public sympathy, but he also knew how easily that influence could be turned into a personal claim. The prince feared that once one person was presented as the continuation of his mother, her memory would stop being a legacy and become a position that others could compete to inherit. The closed meeting reached its point of no return when a senior courtier began reading Meghan's written proposal. The official described her as a possible, modern continuation of Diana's compassionate mission. Before the sentence was finished, William placed one hand flat on the table and stopped him. His voice remained controlled, but the meaning was unmistakable. "No living member of this family will be presented as her successor," he said. "Not Meghan, not Catherine, not even her sons." Meghan felt the rejection land with more force than anyone in the room understood. She believed the palace was willing to use Diana's image, while refusing to let anyone challenge its control over her story. William believed he had just protected his mother from being turned into a royal role that could be awarded, marketed, inherited, or claimed. Neither moved closer to the other. The silence hardened around them. Harry heard Meghan's anger later in a private recorded conversation preserved in their personal account of the meeting. She told him the palace feared her connection with Diana because the comparison gave her influence that did not depend on royal approval. He listened, troubled by her pain, but equally aware of why his brother had drawn the line. Charles acted soon afterward. The king approved a written restriction banning phrases such as Diana's successor, Diana's heir, and the new Diana from official negotiations, invitations, ceremonial descriptions, or royal programs. The instruction was clear, private, and final. Meghan had now used the exact phrase the monarch prohibited. What began as a rejected proposal was about to become a face-to-face battle over memory, authority, and the boundaries she refused to accept. The confrontation took place without cameras, ceremonial uniforms, or prepared speeches. Meghan entered believing she could force the palace to discuss her return. Charles entered determined to end the conversation before the forbidden title gained legitimacy. Between them sat a single printed request containing Diana's name. For several minutes, neither touched it. Then Charles pushed the page across the table and asked Meghan to explain why she had used a title he had personally forbidden. Meghan had secured only a restricted private meeting, after insisting that her request concerned family reconciliation, not the permanent restoration of royal status. A restricted meeting meant the conversation was tightly controlled, with no public ceremony and no promise of official duties. She believed that distinction gave her room to negotiate. Charles believed it removed every excuse. The king agreed to hear her because he wanted the truth directly. Was the title a calculated demand, or had Meghan used it as an emotional description without understanding what it meant? She did not hesitate. She told him the phrase reflected survival, courage, and resistance to the same institutional pressure Diana had faced. Charles pointed to the words, Diana's royal successor, and held his voice steady. "You do not inherit her name because you suffered inside this family," he said. The sentence landed hard. Meghan answered that she was not claiming Diana's identity. She was continuing the same fight against public cruelty, isolation, and a system that protected itself before it protected vulnerable women. The monarch's restraint began to break. When Meghan said the monarchy had repeated the mistakes it made with Diana, he pushed back with anger he could no longer hide. He accused her of turning private pain into a weapon whenever she wanted access, security, influence, or sympathy. She told him that the palace called every challenge manipulation because it feared losing control. Meghan slid the request back across the table. She refused to remove the title unless the palace agreed to discuss her conditions. Charles did not sit down again. He closed the folder, placed one hand over it, and declared the meeting finished. Then Meghan revealed the part he had not expected. A public version of the proposal had already been prepared. If negotiations failed, the forbidden title could appear beyond palace control, attached to her return campaign and Diana's name. Charles warned her that any public use would trigger a formal royal response. Such a response was an official statement carrying the authority of the sovereign. It would deny any connection between Meghan's status and Diana's legacy, leaving no room for private.
She had spent 30 years building her place inside the palace walls, and in one afternoon, a single signature made all of it disappear. This is the story of how the kingdom of Aldmore's royal family quietly redrew its entire future, and how one woman was left standing outside the very institution she had given her life to. It began, as these things often do, with a document nobody was supposed to see yet. Inside the private study of Hymir Palace, an aide placed a sealed folder on the long oak table in front of Crown Prince Edric. He opened it slowly, the way a man opens something he already suspects will change his life. Inside was a proposal that had been drafted over months, refined in secret, and now finally ready to be signed. It named his 8-year-old daughter, Princess Alara, as the official junior steward of the crown, a ceremonial-sounding title that in practice carried real authority. The right to represent the family at Commonwealth-style engagements, to train alongside her older brother in preparation for the duties he would one day inherit, and, in the event of a national emergency, to stand in briefly for the heir himself. For Queen Consort Rosalind, the announcement landed like a verdict. She had married into this family later in life, after decades of public scrutiny and a long, difficult road to acceptance. She had worked, by every account from those close to the household, harder than almost anyone to earn her place at formal state functions, to be photographed beside the king without the raised eyebrows and muttered comparisons that had followed her for years. And now, in a single afternoon, a child not yet 9 years old had been handed a title Rosalind herself had spent a lifetime trying to be seen as worthy of. According to people familiar with the household's inner workings, the kind of sourcing that biographers of monarchies the world over rely on, since palaces rarely issue official transcripts of family arguments, Rosalind first heard about the plan not from the king, but from a member of her own staff, who had seen the paperwork circulating among senior advisors before it ever reached her desk. That alone, biographers of royal institutions often note, tends to wound more than the substance of the decision itself. Being told is one thing, finding out secondhand is another. Rosalind went straight to her husband, King Alaric, and asked him plainly whether he had known. He had. He told her he'd approved the framework months earlier, when Prince Edric first raised the idea that the family's next generation needed structure sooner rather than later, given how quickly public sentiment can shift and how unprepared past monarchies have been caught when an heir stumbles unexpectedly into duty. Rosalind pressed him on why she hadn't been told, and by most accounts of what followed, Alaric didn't have a clean answer. He said only that he hadn't wanted to worry her before it was finalized, which, as anyone who studies the psychology of institutional trust will tell you, is rarely the reassurance it's meant to be. Being protected from a decision and being excluded from one can look identical from the outside and feel identical from the inside. To understand why Prince Edric pushed so hard for this, though, you have to go back several months to an event that never made headlines but reshaped how he saw his family's fragility. It happened at a youth service ceremony, one of those public engagements where a young royal is meant to deliver a short, rehearsed statement to a room full of cameras and well-wishers. Edric's own son, 10-year-old Prince Corin, was set to give his first solo address that day. Minutes before he was due to step forward, Corin overheard two officials speaking quietly near the entrance, using the kind of hushed, clipped language that children instinctively recognize as bad news even when they don't understand the details. He didn't hear enough to know what was actually happening, only enough to become convinced something was deeply wrong, that someone he loved might be unwell, and that no one had told him the truth. He said nothing. He walked out and delivered his address exactly as rehearsed, and only weeks later did the family learn how frightened he had been standing on that stage, carrying a private fear entirely on his own. For Edric, that moment became something of a turning point. He came to believe, and reportedly said so directly to his father, that the family could no longer afford to leave its children improvising in moments of crisis, that structure, training, and clearly defined roles weren't a betrayal of tradition, but a form of protection. If Corin had known what to do, who to turn to, what his place was, that day might have looked entirely different. That conviction is what eventually produced the folder that landed on King Alaric's desk. And it's also, according to those who watched the family navigate the weeks that followed, what made the announcement so difficult for Rosalind to simply accept at face value. She didn't doubt that Edric's instincts came from a real place of concern for his children. What she struggled with, by several accounts, was the timing and the optics, a plan that quietly reordered the family's public hierarchy, elevating Edric's branch of the family while leaving her own position looking, for the first time in years, uncertain. She raised her concerns in a private meeting with the king and Prince Edric together, and asked a question that cut straight to what many royal historians consider the real fault line in any modern monarchy. Was this decision about protecting the institution or about protecting popularity? Rosalind argued that Alara's title, however well-intentioned, risked overshadowing other family members who had spent years, in some cases decades, earning smaller responsibilities, one at a time without shortcuts. She specifically raised the position of the king's sister, Princess Wilhelmina, who had quietly carried out royal duties for nearly 30 years without ever receiving a title of this scale. Wasn't it strange, Rosalind asked, that a child could leapfrog a lifetime of service in one afternoon? Edric didn't deny the tension in that argument, but he pushed back, saying this wasn't a reward for merit in the traditional sense. It was preparation for a monarchy that, in an age of instant public scrutiny, could no longer afford to have its future represented by someone untrained and unprepared. He reminded his stepmother gently but firmly that public trust in modern monarchies is not inherited automatically. It has to be actively maintained, generation after generation, and that meant starting early. It was Princess Wilhelmina herself, when consulted, who reportedly offered the most clear-eyed response in the entire debate. Rather than taking offense on her own behalf, she told the king directly that the family's survival mattered more than any one person's sense of being owed something, herself included. She said if structure and early preparation genuinely served the institution's long-term stability, she wouldn't stand in its way, whatever it cost her personally. It was, by the account of those present, the single sentence that ended the argument in the room, even if it didn't end how Rosalind felt about it. That evening, alone with her husband for the first time in days, Rosalind asked him something quieter and far more personal than politics or protocol. She asked whether he had ever seen her as someone who truly belonged at the center of this family, or whether he had simply needed her there for as long as it served him. It's the kind of question biographers of long, complicated royal marriages describe again and again, not really about titles or ceremonies at all, but about whether love and public utility can ever be fully separated once a person has married into an institution rather than simply a spouse. Alaric, by most accounts, didn't answer quickly. He told her he loved her, and that this had never been in question. But he also didn't promise her the public would ever fully embrace her the way it had embraced others before her. He couldn't promise something he didn't control. The following week, the family gathered for what was meant to be a straightforward briefing about upcoming public engagements. Instead, it became the moment the new hierarchy was made visible for the first time outside closed doors. At a modest public reception, Princess Adelaide, Edric's wife, and Alara's mother walked into the room, and within moments, the entire atmosphere shifted. Guests moved toward her. Conversations paused. People waited for the chance to simply shake her hand. When Rosalind entered shortly after, the reaction was polite, respectful, and unmistakably smaller. A few handshakes, a few quiet smiles, and then the room's attention drifted, almost immediately, back toward Adelaide. Nobody said anything cruel. Nobody needed to. The room itself had answered a question the family had spent weeks trying not to ask out loud. Whose presence did the public actually respond to now? For an institution that survives, at its core, on public goodwill rather than any real political power, that kind of silent verdict tends to matter more than any formal announcement ever could. Rosalind noticed. Of course she noticed. Those who study the psychology of long institutional careers often describe a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing something suddenly, but from watching it fade in full view, in real time, with everyone around you pretending not to see it happen too. She didn't cause a scene. She didn't say a single critical word to a single reporter in the weeks that followed. But those close to the household have described her demeanor in that period as measured in a way that felt, to some, less like acceptance and more like quiet recalibration. A woman deciding not how to fight a decision that had already been made, but how to define her role within a family structure that had visibly shifted beneath her feet. Because here is the truth that most retellings of family successions tend to skip past. Nobody in Aldmore's palace ever suggested Rosalind was being pushed out entirely. Her title remained. Her formal position remained. What changed was something far harder to name in a press release. The quiet, cumulative sense of who a family, and a public turn to first. Institutions like this one are built on layers of formal authority and informal trust, and the two don't always move at the same pace. Alara's new role addressed the formal side, training, succession planning, contingency for the unexpected. But it also, whether intentionally or not, accelerated a shift in the informal side that had arguably already been underway for years, one that Rosalind now had to navigate in full public view rather than behind closed doors. In the months that followed, Rosalind did not retreat from public life. If anything, those who watched her closely say she leaned into her existing charitable patronages with a renewed, almost pointed focus, choosing to build depth in the causes she had long supported rather than compete for the kind of broad public spotlight that had, almost overnight, found a new focal point elsewhere in the family. It wasn't resignation by most accounts. It was closer to a recalibrated sense of where her value could still be felt most clearly, not in crowded reception rooms competing for attention, but in the slower, less photographed work of institutions and communities that had relied on her consistency for years, long before any of this began. What this story ultimately reveals isn't really about one child's title, or one stepmother's wounded pride, or even one king's difficult choice between his son's argument and his wife's discomfort. It's about the uncomfortable, universal truth sitting underneath every hereditary institution that has managed to survive into the modern era. Influence and formal authority are not the same thing, and the moment an institution starts preparing its next generation in public, it inevitably exposes exactly how much of its current order was built on personal relationships rather than fixed rules. Rosalind's title never changed on paper, but something else did, and everyone in that palace, including her, understood it the moment the announcement went out. Whether old Ms. Monarchy handled this transition wisely or clumsily is something historians will likely still be debating decades from now, the way they debate every succession crisis that came before it. What's harder to debate is the human cost sitting quietly underneath the politics. A woman who spent 30 years learning to belong somewhere, watching a new chapter begin that, for the first time in a long time, wasn't being written with her at its center. Institutions endure. People, even the ones wearing crowns, still have to find a way to endure right alongside them.